In the late 1980s in Uganda, a group led by Credonia Mwerinde and Joseph Kibwetere would emerge, claiming to have divine knowledge that the end of the world was near. Followers flocked to them, abandoning their lives, their homes, and even their families, believing salvation lay in strict obedience to the Ten Commandments. But as the year 2000 approached, things took a dark and tragic turn.
And they used to call themselves holy people.
How do you systematically exterminate 1,000 people unnoticed?
Keeping 10 commandments, what about the fifth one?
Thou shalt not kill.
Hello and welcome back to my channel where we talk about all things true crime. Today we're going to be talking about one of the absolute craziest cults that I have ever heard of, the cult known as the Movement for the Restoration of the Ten Commandments of God, which is a Ugandan Doomsday cult. I had never heard of this cult until I came across a TikTok video that led me down the rabbit hole, and quite unfortunately there's not a lot of information that is known about this cult, so bear with me. I will be trying to give as much information as I have, but without further ado, grab a drink, grab a snack, and let's dive right into the story. So the story begins in November of 1932 when a man named Joseph Kibwetere was born. He came from a pious Catholic background, and in his adult life he was considered somewhat wealthy according to Ugandan standards. In 1980 he ran for a political office, and I don't exactly know how that went. I don't know whether he ended up winning the elections and ended up in the political office, but nonetheless that running or those elections, the campaigning for the political office gained him quite the reputation. He also owned enough land to donate some of the land for a Catholic school to be built, and some reports also say that he founded the Catholic school and that the school was also ran in Orthodox ways, in Orthodox Catholic ways. Due to his political and religious experience, he ended up becoming a very influential and well-respected man. So in 1984, Joseph claimed that he was experiencing some visions of Virgin Mary, which are otherwise known as the Marian apparitions, and this will come into play a little bit later on in the story. He was married to a woman named Teresa with whom he had children, and according to Teresa, their marriage was a pretty happy marriage. It was loving, it was warm, and Joseph was a happy and loving father to their children as well. But that would all change in 1989 when he came across a woman named Credonia Mwerinde. So Credonia was born in 1952. No exact date of birth was found during my research, and not much was found on her childhood either, apart from the fact that she was also born into a religious family. At some point during her life, she began working as a shopkeeper, a banana beer brewer, and she was also working as a sex worker. To many people, she was known as a violent bar owner, hence it came as a shock to them when Credonia suddenly turned a new leaf, became a devout Christian, claiming to be having some visions about the Virgin Mary, or visions of the Virgin Mary. But this was not new at all to Credonia and some members of her family. See, in 1960, when Credonia was just 8 years old, her father claimed to have had a vision of his deceased daughter called Evangelista, who then told him that he would have visions of heaven. This prediction came to pass in 1988 when he had visions of Jesus Christ, the Virgin Mary, as well as Saint Joseph. His daughter Credonia would then later on go on to have the same visions of Virgin Mary. And so in 1989 he told Credonia that she should start spreading the message, the Virgin Mary's message, across Uganda, and that this was the Virgin Mary's instructions. And so Credonia and her sister Ursula set off. That very same year they met an esteemed man called Joseph Kibwetere, and now we've circled back to their meeting in 1989. So when they met Joseph, he was very willing to listen. This is not their first time that they had preached to people about them having visions of the Virgin Mary, but unlike many people, Joseph was willing to listen because he had had a similar apparition years earlier, 5 years prior. So he welcomed them with open arms, he listened, and he even shared his own experiences with them. Credonia even told him that the Virgin Mary had instructed him to take them in, which he did without even questioning Credonia, without even questioning this instruction of the Virgin Mary. Mind you, he had an entire family, he had a wife, he had children, but he still opened his home up for these strangers to move in. He didn't bat an eyelid. And this meeting of theirs is what would lead to the formation of the Movement for the Restoration of the Ten Commandments of God. That name is a mouthful, so I'm just going to be calling it the movement from here onwards. So they lived with Joseph, his wife Teresa, and kids for about 2 years. During this time, they were forming and growing the movement. Teresa described Credonia as a cruel woman who never smiled. She believed that Credonia disliked her because it seemed as if she just wanted to turn Joseph against his own wife. Joseph pretty much believed everything that Credonia said. If Credonia accused Teresa of doing something wrong or of being evil, Joseph would just easily believe Credonia without using his own judgment and his own discretion. And so after meeting Credonia, their marriage was simply never the same again. So during this time, while they were living with Joseph, Credonia's father was said to be the leader of the cult, of this movement, but later on he would pass on and Joseph Kibwetere would become the leader. However, most of the cult's members believed that Credonia was the actual leader and Joseph was more so just the mouthpiece, because Credonia would have all the instructions, as she was the one who was claiming to be having all these visions from Virgin Mary, and she was claiming that all her instructions came directly from the Virgin Mary. But I'm getting a bit ahead of myself, so let's circle back to where we were. So once a respected member of the community like Joseph joined in on this movement, or whatever Credonia was preaching to the country at large, of course it became a bit more popular, and so the group started growing rapidly. They would also do some radio broadcasts during which they would preach about this message and the Virgin Marys, and they would also preach about an apparent apocalypse that was coming according to the Virgin Mary. And so of course, because they were doing these radio broadcasts that could reach the entire country, they started gaining a lot of traction and attention. What they were preaching was basically that heaven was only promised to those members who truly respected and obeyed the Ten Commandments, which is also why they named their group the Movement for the Restoration of the Ten Commandments of God. So because Joseph and his wife were no longer in good terms, and the village people were just annoyed of this cult that was forming right in their neighborhood, in 1992 the cult was pushed out of the village. They were actually ordered out of the village by village elders, and that's when they moved to the Kanungu district, which is in southwestern Uganda, and that's where Credonia's father basically gave them a large property where they lived, and the cult started growing in large numbers from that point going forward. So the goal for this movement was to preach of the Ten Commandments, of course, and the Word of God. The leaders of the cult taught the members that in order to avoid eternal damnation during the apocalypse, they had to strictly follow and abide by the Ten Commandments. Now that they were living in this large land, of course, like I said, large numbers of people started flocking in. Some would come with their kids, some would come with their partners, and some with their entire families. At first they would only come to do some work on the property, so maybe to work in the fields, to work on maybe some building projects or whatever it is that they were doing around the property. But eventually they would go on to abandon their entire lives and live in Kanungu. Most of them would sell all their property and then give whatever money they made from the sale to Credonia and Joseph. So here in this place that they were living in, they had to follow very strict rules that they were given by their leaders, under the guise that these were the instructions that came directly from the Virgin Mary. Firstly, they all had to wear matching uniforms. Even the visitors claimed that whenever they went to this compound in Kanungu, they would have to surrender their clothing, their regular clothing, to the leaders, and then they would be given the uniforms that they would put on and have on during their entire visit. And then whenever they felt like leaving, they would be given their clothes so that they could leave with their clothing. And this kind of made everyone look the same in the compound. Secondly, they were also discouraged from talking, and this was said to be a means of avoiding dishonesty or saying anything that would be considered sinful. So the members would resort to using their own form of sign language instead of actually speaking, which I think also maintained the element of secrecy, because people were not talking, word wasn't getting around. And I'm pretty sure other villages, even if they could like be a bit nosy like how I would be, I would try to like walk past the compound or something, but I'm pretty sure even if other neighbors tried to do something nosy, they couldn't really understand whatever it is that they were saying using their own form of sign language, because they weren't using the kind of sign language that is used by everybody else. They used their own sign language, their own internal sign language. So like I said, I think this just improved or built on the element of secrecy. It ensured that whatever it is that they were doing within the cult stayed or remained a secret. Thirdly, fornication or sexual intercourse was forbidden, as well as soap, and the sexual intercourse was forbidden even amongst married couples. So it was completely frowned upon, and nobody was allowed to have sex, and nobody was allowed to use soap. They believed that AIDS was a punishment from God for breach of the 6th commandment, thou shalt not commit adultery, and that is why they frowned upon sexual intercourse and just sexual relations in general. Of course, people believed it because this was around the time when Uganda was experiencing the AIDS epidemic. So of course fears were high, and when people are in absolute shock, or when people are fearful for either their lives, their livelihood, or the unknown, absolute unknown, because during this time people were not well educated on how to protect themselves, how to manage the illness, and so on and so forth. People were just terrified. And so when you're telling them that, hey, this is a punishment from God, and if you stop doing this, then you will be on the safer side, God will not punish you with this, people believed it and they ran with it. So they did not have any sexual relations within the cult. Members would also fast regularly, so they would only have one meal on Monday and on Friday, and everything else in between they would go unfed. And remember that some people came with their children, and also this was a self-sustaining commune or a self-sustaining compound, so most of the people would work in the fields. They also had a school where some of the members would teach the children. They were doing everything by themselves, so you can imagine all this hard work on an empty stomach, and you only got to eat twice in a week. You only had one meal on Monday and one meal on Friday, and everything else in between, I don't even know if they were allowed to have water, or they simply had to just go about their day on a completely empty stomach. So the movement grew even more in importance once a very esteemed and well-educated priest joined the cult. This was a man called Dominic Kataribabo, who had a PhD that he had acquired at a university in the United States. So of course this just gained him even more respect. A lot of people looked up to him, a lot of people respected him. And so when Dominique joined this cult, naturally everybody else who respected him and looked up to him and trusted his judgment followed. Usually people tend to trust more educated people, so you believe that when an educated person is doing something, that should mean that that thing is right, or that is the correct way to go about things, you know. So it does not even shock me that after Dominique joined, Dr. Dominique, by the way, joined, other people started joining, and the cult just grew significantly. So the church all in all had 5 leaders. It had Credonia, of course, Joseph Kibwetere. It also had Dominique Kataribabo. It also had a man called Joseph Kapurai, and a man called John Kamagara. But we all know who the real leader was. By the late 1990s, the movement had grown into a large group of over 5,000 members. They didn't all live in the same compound. Most of them lived in different areas. They would live in groups, but in different areas, because this over 5,000 membership was from across all of Uganda. They all survived by working on the land, so by farming, and also using some of the money that they had all pulled together, since most of the members, if not all of the members, had sold their property before joining the cult. Joseph Kibwetere had also sold his properties, his car, and his milling machines, and it wouldn't surprise me if he gave all the proceeds to Credonia. Like I mentioned earlier, they also had a school within their premises where all the children would go to learn, and the members would also act as teachers in these schools. Some of the members were professionals, you know, esteemed professionals even, so it just made sense for them to work in the school and give the children the limited knowledge that they wanted the children to be exposed to. And some of the information was of course inaccurate, because I'm pretty sure they were being taught whatever the Virgin Mary wanted them to know. So the leaders were still preaching about the apocalypse and the promise of this new world only to those who obeyed and followed the 10 commandments, and the members were made to believe that this cult was akin to Noah's Ark. Credonia started telling the members that the apocalypse, or the end of the world, would happen on the 31st of December 1999, and as the new millennium approached, people were urged to confess their sins in preparation for this new world, or in preparation for the end. But what they were being told was not that the world was going to end for everybody. Like I said, the members were made to believe that the cult was akin to Noah's Ark. So they were made to believe that everybody else in the world would perish, but they would survive, because they were the ones who, you know, were strongly committed to obeying and following the 10 commandments, and they were the ones who were members of this cult. So everybody else was going to perish, but they were going to survive. This is what the members were made to believe. This is what the teachings were all about. As the 31st approached, many of the old members also started rejoining the cult, simply out of fear, of course. Like I said, they were made to believe that everybody else who was not a member of this cult would perish, and so large numbers of old members started rejoining the cult again. Some people sold all their earthly possessions at a really cheap price, all in preparation for this apocalypse. All the work in the field also stopped, as people were now eagerly awaiting the end of the world as they knew it and the beginning of a new life. But as you and I expected, the 31st came and went, and nothing ever happened. As you can imagine, this started, or it wreaked some chaos within the cult, as members now started questioning Credonia and Joseph. Finally, members were not sure about their credibility anymore, so they were questioning them quite a lot. They were applying pressure. They were stepping on their necks. Some people even left the cult, while some demanded their money back from Credonia and Joseph. But unfortunately, there are still many who remained. My guess is that they had seen all the way through Credonia and Joseph's bullshit, but they simply could not leave the cult. Remember that, like I said, some people had joined with their families, their entire families. Some people had joined with their children, maybe single mothers, single fathers. Some people had joined with their partners. Some people, most of the people had joined and they didn't have nothing else going for them outside of the cult. They had sold all their property, they had no money, and because they had sold all their property, of course this left them vulnerable and destitute, and they had nothing else to look forward to outside. So their only way of surviving was to just remain a part of this cult. That is just my guess. I really don't know why some members remained. Of course, some of them could have remained because they still fully believed in whatever bullshit Credonia was feeding them, but I do believe that some of them simply remained because they had nowhere else to go. They had nothing else outside of the cult. I mean, think about it. Who would take in an entire family? Who would take in an entire family that has nothing to offer? A family that doesn't have a paycheck, doesn't have anything, basically. A family that has nothing. An entire family, maybe a family of 4, a family of 3. Even 2 people is a bit much. So I know that not a lot of people would take them in, and so perhaps some of them just made a calculated decision and decided to stay in the cult anyway. Besides, most of them had been a part of the cult for many years, and at that point it was all they knew. Regardless, there was still some chaos. Some members were leaving, some questions were being asked, and of course, like I said, they applied pressure, basically. So Credonia and Joseph panicked, and I'm assuming in their panic state, that's when they decided to come up with this new date for the apocalypse. And the new date that they had come up with was the 17th of March 2000. So again, members had to sit and wait for the end of the world. On the days leading up to the supposed end of the world, members of the cult began acting weird. On the 14th of March, all the members of the cult paid all their taxes and arrears thereof, and they also paid off all their debts, and they also made amends with everybody that they had wronged. Dominique Kataribabo was also spotted buying 50 liters of sulfuric acid, which can also be used to start fires. On the 16th of March, so a day before the end of the world, members were also told to tidy up the premises and also wash their clothes because there would be many visitors the following day, and so of course they did exactly as they were instructed. They washed their clothes and they tidied the place up. They also fetched a lot of water, and at this time, as usual, members had been fasting and eagerly awaiting the Friday meal. On the day, so on the 17th of March 2000, they held a huge party where they roasted 3 bulls, and they also had 70 crates of Coca-Cola. Just minutes after some of the outside members had arrived, villagers nearby heard a loud explosion, and in seconds the entire building was engulfed in flames, killing all 530 people in attendance. The windows and doors of the building that all the people had been in had completely been barricaded to avoid anybody coming out. So they had been closed with wood and some nails. They had been nailed shut. Nobody could come in or go out. A neighbor later recalled that the fire had caused everything to be covered in smoke and the smell of burning flesh, which was so terrible that many of the villagers could not eat meat for several months after the fire. At first, authorities believed that this was a mass suicide, but upon further investigations, they started believing otherwise. 4 days after the fire, the police started investigating all the cult leaders' properties. A foul smell led them to a building in the Kanungu compound where 6 more bodies had been found. Some of them had been badgered, some of them had been strangled, and some of them had been poisoned. A week later, 150 more bodies were found in a mass grave nearby. Then 81 bodies were found, and then 130 more bodies were discovered. But this was not all, because they hadn't investigated all the properties as yet. After searching all the sites, police announced the final death toll to be 924. 924 people died. Some of these people had been dead for 3 weeks, but some had been dead for months. And like I said, some of them had been strangled, some of them had been beaten, badgered, some had been poisoned. And it was suspected that after the 31st of December came and went and nothing happened, people just simply started asking too many questions for the leaders' liking, and so they had to be silenced. Some of them were also demanding their money, and because the leaders could not give them their money, maybe they didn't have the money or they simply couldn't bear to part with people's money, again, they had to be silenced. So it's believed that most of these matters happened after the 31st, once people started asking questions that should have been asked way ahead of time. The investigation was noted as an inadequate investigation because Uganda simply did not have the necessary forensic resources to take up this investigation. Some people were asking questions like, how could such a cult happen right under the authorities' nose and nobody ever investigated the cult? But there were simply no answers. And although it was initially suspected or assumed that all the 5 cult leaders had died in the fire, the police later believed that they didn't die, or rather they believed that Joseph, Kibwetere and Credonia were still alive, and so they issued an international warrant for their arrest. There were some reports made earlier this year that Joseph was hiding in Malawi, but as of today, no arrests have ever been made regarding this particular case. But that's it for today's story, my loves. Let me know all your thoughts, theories and opinions in the comment section down below. And if you're intrigued by this type of content, please consider liking and subscribe for more. Bye.